Before we begin, imagine a world where the contents of a single ship's hold could overturn a kingdom, where one cargo could make a merchant richer than most kings, or send him to the bottom of the ocean chasing a dream, where wars were fought not over land, not over ideology, but over the right to sell a handful of dried berries, or a bolt of fabric, or a small stone that caught the light in a particular way. So settle in. We are going back, centuries, sometimes millennia, to the docks and the harbours, the Spice Islands and the silk markets, the salt flats and the amber shores. We are going to meet the merchants and the sailors, the emperors and the smugglers, and we are going to find out exactly what cargo made sailors rich. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean, in the year 1498, a Portuguese caravel called the São Gabriel was riding low in the water. Her captain was a lean, stubborn man from Sines named Vasco da Gama, and he had just done something no European sailor had ever done. He had rounded the southern tip of Africa, crossed an open ocean without a fixed coastline to guide him, and arrived, after 10 months at sea, on the coast of southwestern India. He had lost nearly half his crew to scurvy, dysentery, and despair. His ships were creaking and salt-encrusted. His men had eaten through their rations and were surviving on whatever they could trade or beg from the coastal towns they passed. And yet, when a local merchant in the Indian port of Calicut finally asked him, through an interpreter, in a mix of Arabic and broken Portuguese, what it was he had come so far to find, Da Gama's answer was immediate and simple. Spices, he said, and Christians. The Christians, as it turned out, were harder to find than expected. The spices were everywhere. Calicut, today called Kozhikode, was one of the great commercial hubs of the medieval world, a city where pepper was piled in warehouses like grain, where ginger and cinnamon and cardamom moved through the markets with the easy familiarity of bread and salt. Arab merchants had been sailing to this coast for centuries, and they looked at Da Gama's battered little flotilla with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. What could this rough-faced foreigner from the cold Atlantic edge of the world possibly offer in exchange for the most valuable commodities on earth? He had brought bolts of cloth, some coral, some honey, and a few hats. The local merchants laughed. They were accustomed to trading with the merchants of Cairo and Baghdad and Constantinople, men who arrived with gold and silver and sophisticated goods, not with the equivalent of a tourist's suitcase. But Da Gama was not deterred, because Da Gama understood something that the Arab merchants had always known and kept very carefully to themselves. The spices sitting in those warehouses, which cost a few copper coins per pound here in Calicut, would sell in Lisbon for 100 times that price. The markup was not an exaggeration. It was, in fact, conservative. A single successful voyage, loaded with pepper and spices, would earn returns of 3,000%. And that staggering, almost incomprehensible gap between the price of a thing at its source and the price of that same thing at its destination is the engine that drove the entire age of exploration. It is the engine that drove most of human commercial history. It is what cargo is really about. Before we go further into Da Gama's story, before we follow the spice routes and the silk roads and the silver galleons, it is worth pausing for a moment on that fundamental idea. The idea of the margin, the spread, the difference between what a thing costs where it grows and what it is worth somewhere far away, where it cannot grow, where it is rare, where it has become woven into the fabric of daily life, or status, or medicine, or desire. This gap, this invisible gulf between supply and scarcity, is the force that has moved ships across oceans for as long as there have been ships. It is the reason men have always been willing to get on a wooden boat and sail into the unknown. And it is the reason that certain cargoes, at certain moments in history, were worth more than their weight in gold. In fact, some of them were worth more than gold itself. The ocean has always been a place of transformation. A man who stepped onto a dock in Genoa or Lisbon or Amsterdam in the 15th or 16th century might be unremarkable in every way. Middling wealth, middling prospects. The same horizon visible from his window every morning. But if he could get a share of the right cargo, if his ship came in loaded with the right goods from the right part of the world, he could step off that same dock a year later as a different kind of man entirely. Wealth on a scale that the land economy could barely produce in a generation could arrive in a season. Empires were funded by it. Cities were built from it. The modern world, its financial systems, its trade networks, its geopolitical boundaries, was shaped by men chasing the profits hidden in a ship's hold. This is their story. And it begins, as so many stories do, with something almost impossibly small, a dried berry, no larger than a pea, that once cost a Roman merchant his entire month's earnings for a single pound, and that would eventually drive European civilization to circumnavigate the globe. It begins with pepper. To understand why spices could make a man rich beyond reason in medieval Europe, you need to understand what food tasted like without them, and what preservation meant in a world without refrigeration. Meat spoiled. It spoiled fast, and it spoiled badly, and the taste of decay was not something that could simply be pushed aside. The people of medieval Europe, noble and common alike, lived in a world where the line between fresh and rotten was navigated daily, where the winter months brought salted and dried provisions that tasted of nothing except age and salt, and where the arrival of spices was nothing short of miraculous. Pepper masked the taste of decay. Cinnamon transformed flat and tasteless puddings into something resembling luxury. Nutmeg was believed to ward off the plague, a belief that, while medically useless, drove demand to extraordinary heights during the great plague years of the 14th century. Cloves numbed toothache pain with their eugenol oil. Ginger aided digestion and warming in cold climates. These were not merely condiments. They were medicine, preservation, and pleasure combined in a single commodity. And they could only come from one part of the world. Pepper, the king of spices, grew in the forests of the Malabar coast of India, the same coast where da Gama would eventually arrive. The long black pepper vine, Piper nigrum, coiled up the trees in the humid coastal forests of what is now the Indian state of Kerala, producing tight clusters of berries that, when dried, became the small wrinkled peppercorns that were shoveled into European dishes with almost religious devotion. White pepper was the same berry, processed differently. Green pepper was the fresh, unripe berry. All of them came from this narrow coastal strip, this lush green margin between the Western Ghats Mountains and the Arabian Sea, where the climate was exactly right and nowhere else on Earth, at least as far as anyone in Europe knew, could replicate it. Cinnamon came from the island of Sri Lanka, called Ceylon by the Europeans who would later fight over it. The bark was peeled from a specific species of tree, cinnamomum verum, and only the inner layers, carefully rolled into quills and dried, produced the true cinnamon that merchants demanded. Everything else was cassia, a coarser cousin that could fool a common buyer, but not a trained spice merchant's nose. The difference in price between true Ceylon cinnamon and common cassia was significant enough to sustain an entire industry of deception. Cloves grew, and in the 15th century grew exclusively on a tiny cluster of volcanic islands in what is now eastern Indonesia. The Maluku Islands, known to the Portuguese as the Moluccas, and to history as the Spice Islands, were so small that on a modern map they barely register as specks in the wide blue expanse of the Banda Sea. But they were the only place on Earth where the clove tree, Syzygium aromaticum, produced its aromatic buds in commercial quantities, and this geographical fact made them the most strategically important pieces of real estate in the world for almost 2 centuries. Nutmeg was even more localized. It grew, again exclusively, on the Banda Islands, a small archipelago within the Maluku group, 10 small volcanic islands that together could be crossed on foot in a day. The nutmeg tree produces 2 spices from a single fruit, the outer lacy covering of the seed, dried and sold as mace, and the seed itself, ground into nutmeg. Both were valuable. Both came only from these 10 tiny islands, and both would become the subject of one of the most violent and calculated acts of colonial brutality in recorded history. But first, they had to get to Europe, and that journey, before da Gama, before the Portuguese carracks rounded Africa, was one of the most elaborate supply chains the ancient world had ever produced, and it was controlled almost entirely by Arab merchants who had no particular interest in sharing either the profits or the geographical knowledge that made those profits possible. The spice trade from India and the Spice Islands to the Mediterranean was ancient. Archaeologists have found cloves in a burned cooking vessel in Syria, dated to roughly 1700 BC, more than 3,000 years before the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean. The Egyptians used cinnamon and cassia in their embalming preparations. The Bible mentions spices in contexts that suggest their extraordinary value was already well established. By the time of ancient Rome, the spice trade was one of the most developed long-distance commercial networks in the world, and it moved through a series of intermediary hands. Indian merchants to Arab traders, to Red Sea ports, to Alexandrian warehouses, to Roman wholesale merchants, each layer adding its markup to the final price. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, was openly furious about this. He calculated that Rome was spending something like 100 million sesterces per year on spices and other luxuries from the East, an enormous sum, a drain of real money flowing out of the Roman economy and into the pockets of foreign merchants who controlled the middleman positions. He complained that the spices were being sold for 100 times their original cost. He could not do anything about it, because neither he nor anyone else in Rome knew exactly where the spices came from. The Arab merchants who brought them to the Red Sea. Ports were careful to keep that information opaque, and they supplemented the mystery with deliberate disinformation. Tales of cinnamon harvested from birds' nests in inaccessible cliffs. Stories of rivers guarded by flying serpents. Legends of spice gardens maintained by gods. The geography of spice was, for centuries, a matter of controlled mythology. This information asymmetry, the gap between what the spice merchants knew and what their customers knew, was itself a form of cargo. It was worth protecting fiercely. and the Arab traders did protect it, generation after generation, with stories and secrecy, and the careful management of routes that no European navigator could follow. The monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean were their private highway. They understood the seasonal reversal of those winds. The southwest monsoon that carried ships from Arabia to India in summer, and the northeast monsoon that brought them home in winter, thousands of years before any European navigator had any idea that such a system existed. This knowledge of the monsoon cycle was possibly the most valuable piece of navigational intelligence in the ancient world, and it remained an Arab and Indian secret for an extraordinarily long time. By the medieval period, the spice trade had crystallized into a structure that would persist for centuries. Arab dhows carried spices from India and Indonesia to the ports of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. From there, overland caravans or small coastal vessels moved the goods to Cairo or Alexandria or the Levantine ports. And at those ports, waiting with their factors and their ledger books, and their carefully maintained relationships with Egyptian and Arab wholesalers, were the Venetians. Venice, in the 13th and 14th centuries, was quite possibly the richest city in the world relative to its size. It was a city that had been built on nothing, literally on wooden piles driven into the soft mud of a lagoon, and had transformed that nothing into everything through the relentless, disciplined, almost fanatically focused pursuit of trade. The Venetians had no farmland worth speaking of, no forests, no mines, no raw materials of any significance. What they had was geography, a position at the northern end of the Adriatic that gave them access to the markets of northern Europe. And they had turned that geography into a commercial empire of extraordinary sophistication. The spice trade was its crown jewel. Venetian galleys made the run to Alexandria and the Levantine ports on a regular schedule, loading up with pepper and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, purchased through the city's long-established relationships with Arab wholesalers, and bringing them back to Venice, where they were distributed throughout Europe at prices that made the Republic fantastically wealthy. The Venetian spice merchants were not simply traders. They were the gatekeepers of the entire European spice supply. They set the prices, they controlled the flow, and they maintained their position through a combination of commercial diplomacy, military force when necessary, and the careful cultivation of exclusive relationships with suppliers. This monopoly, and it was, functionally, a monopoly, inflamed the merchants and kings of Western Europe for generations. The Portuguese were perhaps the most motivated to break it. Portugal was a small country on the Atlantic edge of Europe, with no access to the Mediterranean spice routes, no leverage over Venetian prices, and a deeply practical tradition of maritime exploration developed over decades of sailing the African coast. If there was a sea route to the spices that bypassed both the Arab middlemen and the Venetian gatekeepers, a route around the bottom of Africa and across the Indian Ocean, Portugal would find it. They did, and da Gama's arrival in Calicut in 1498 was the moment everything changed. But the change was not immediate, and it was not bloodless. Da Gama's first voyage returned to Lisbon with a modest cargo of spices, enough to prove the concept and excite investors, but not enough to flood the market. His second voyage, in 1502, was different in every sense. He arrived at Calicut with a fleet of 25 ships, and he arrived not as a trader seeking permission, but as a conqueror asserting control. He bombarded the city. He captured Arab merchant ships, and burned them with their crews inside. He established by violence the Portuguese intention to dominate the Indian Ocean spice trade, and he returned home with a cargo so large that the profit from the voyage, according to contemporary accounts, was 60 times its cost. The Portuguese model was simple and brutal: force. They did not try to compete with Arab and Indian merchants in a free market. They patrolled the sea routes, demanded that all ships buy licenses to trade, licenses sold at the point of a cannon, and systematically destroyed the commercial infrastructure that had sustained the Arab spice trade for centuries. Within a generation, Portuguese forts dotted the coast of Africa and India. Portuguese warships controlled the choke points of the Indian Ocean, and the spice that had been moving from the Malabar coast through Arab hands to Venetian warehouses was now, increasingly, moving through Portuguese hulls to Lisbon. But Portugal's dominance was itself temporary, and the next chapter in the spice story brought us to those tiny, remote, impossibly important Banda Islands, and to the nutmeg trade, and to an act of violence that should be more famous than it is. The Banda Islands, when the Portuguese first arrived in the early 16th century, were inhabited by a sophisticated trading society with long-established relationships with Javanese and Malay merchants. The Bandanese grew nutmeg and mace, traded them across the archipelago, and had no particular interest in being absorbed into a European commercial empire. When the Dutch arrived, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, the organization that would eventually come to control the entire spice trade, they had a different approach from the Portuguese. Rather than simply demanding control of the trading posts, they wanted something more absolute. They wanted the islands themselves and everything on them, managed as a controlled plantation economy with no interference from the existing population. In 1621, a Dutch Governor-General named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen arrived in the Banda Islands with a fleet, a mandate from the VOC's shareholders, and almost no mercy. What followed was a systematic extermination. The Bandanese population, which had numbered perhaps 15,000 people before the Dutch arrived, was reduced through killing, starvation, and enslavement to perhaps 1,000 within 5 years. The survivors were enslaved and forced to work the nutmeg plantations under conditions of extraordinary brutality. Cohen divided the islands into parcels called perken, distributed them to Dutch colonists called perkeneers, and established a controlled economy in which the perkeneers were required to sell their entire nutmeg harvest to the VOC at fixed, artificially low prices. The VOC then sold those same nutmegs in Europe at prices that maintained the enormous markup. For decades, it worked. The VOC's nutmeg monopoly was enforced with regular armed patrols that destroyed any nutmeg trees found outside the Banda Islands, and soaked, exported nutmeg in lime to prevent the seeds from germinating elsewhere. The botanical secret of nutmeg, the fact that it could grow anywhere with similar climate, was as carefully guarded as the Arab merchants had once guarded the geographical location of the Spice Islands. Knowledge was power. Botanical knowledge, in the age of spice, could be worth a fortune. It would eventually slip out, as all secrets do. French and British botanists, working with stolen or smuggled plants, eventually established nutmeg plantations in other parts of the tropics, in Grenada, in Mauritius, in Zanzibar, and the VOC's monopoly collapsed. When the monopoly went, so did the extraordinary prices. And when the prices fell, the nutmeg ceased to be worth killing for. It became ordinary. Today, a jar of ground nutmeg sits in kitchen cupboards throughout the world for less than the price of a cup of coffee, and almost no one who uses it knows that it was once the most expensive commodity in the world, that men sailed 50,000 miles to find it, that an entire people was exterminated so that it could be sold at a premium. The clove story has a particularly strange footnote that connects the 16th century to today. Among the 5 small islands of the original clove-growing region in the Maluku archipelago, there was one called Ternate. And on Ternate, there grew for centuries a particular clove tree known as the Afo tree, or sometimes the Chenke Afo, claimed by local tradition to be the oldest clove tree in the world, and possibly the tree from which all clove cultivation outside Indonesia was eventually derived. It stood for several hundred years, gnarled and enormous, an accidental monument to an era when the ground beneath it was the most commercially valuable soil on earth. The Portuguese word for pepper was pimenta. From this we get Jamaica pepper, allspice, and several other names that still carry traces of the confusion and excitement of those early contact years, when European sailors were encountering unfamiliar spices and reaching for the closest word they knew. The entire Caribbean was named the West Indies because Columbus, sailing west, looking for the spice-producing East Indies, refused to believe he had found something entirely different. He called the people he encountered Indians. He called the capsicum peppers. He found Indian pepper. He called the islands the Indies. The spices drove him there, and the name stuck to a whole hemisphere. Back in Europe, the arrival of large Portuguese spice cargoes did eventually break the Venetian monopoly. Though Venice fought back with every diplomatic and commercial tool it possessed, including temporarily rerouting some of the spice trade back through Egypt when Ottoman control of the Middle East made overland transport viable again. But the Portuguese sea route was simply cheaper, faster, and more direct than any overland alternative. And within a few decades of da Gama's first voyage, the center of gravity of the European spice trade had shifted from Venice to Lisbon. Lisbon, which had been a modest Atlantic port of no great commercial consequence, became one of the richest cities in Europe almost overnight. Its warehouses bulged with pepper. Its merchants became millionaires. Its king became powerful enough to commission some of the most magnificent architecture in Europe, including the Geronimos Monastery, built partly with spice revenue and still standing today as one of the glories of Portuguese Manueline architecture. And behind all of it, the voyages, the wars, the massacres, the monopolies, the fortunes, the extraordinary architecture, was the small, unprepossessing dried berry that a Roman merchant had once paid a month's wages to season his dinner. There is a story, probably legendary, certainly useful, about how the secret of silk left China. According to this tale, which appears in Byzantine chronicles and has been repeated by historians ever since, 2 Nestorian Christian monks arrived at the court of the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, sometime around the year 550 AD, and they brought with them something they had carried in the hollow shafts of their walking staves, past Chinese border guards, across the deserts of Central Asia, and over the mountains of Persia. Inside those hollow canes were mulberry silkworm eggs. If the story is true, and it captures something real about the nature of industrial espionage, even if the precise details are invented, those monks carried inside those canes the end of a monopoly that had lasted, by some estimates, for nearly 3,000 years. Because silk, unlike spices, was not merely a product of a particular geography. It was the product of a particular knowledge. The knowledge of how to cultivate the mulberry silkworm, Bombyx mori, how to reel the cocoon threads, how to weave the resulting filament into the lustrous, extraordinary fabric that had no equal in the ancient world. That knowledge was Chinese, and it was protected by the Chinese state, with penalties that were not subtle. Revealing the secret of silk cultivation to foreigners was, at various points in Chinese history, punishable by death. Silk had been produced in China for at least 5,000 years when those monks allegedly made their crossing. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Chinese were cultivating silkworms and weaving silk as early as 3000 BC, and possibly earlier. By the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly contemporary with the Roman Empire, China had developed the entire sericulture process to a level of sophistication that no other civilization could approach. The mulberry trees were cultivated specifically for their leaves, which were the only food the silkworms would eat. The silkworms were raised in carefully controlled conditions. Temperature, humidity, and the timing and quantity of feeding all had to be managed precisely. When the worm spun its cocoon, the cocoon was treated with hot water or steam to kill the pupa inside before it could hatch and break the continuous thread. The thread was then reeled off. A single cocoon could yield nearly a mile of filament, impossibly fine, and twisted with other threads into yarn. Skilled weavers, working on looms that were themselves technological marvels, turned that yarn into fabric of a quality that had to be felt to be believed. The sensation of silk against skin is genuinely unlike anything else. It is smooth in a way that seems impossible for a woven fabric. It has a natural sheen that catches and moves with light in ways that dyed cotton or wool simply cannot replicate. It breathes and drapes and moves differently from any other textile, in a world where the alternatives were rough, wool, scratchy linen, or animal hide. Silk was extraordinary in a physical sense that went beyond mere status signaling. It felt, quite literally, like nothing else. When silk arrived in the Roman Empire, carried westward along the overland route that would later be called the Silk Road, the Roman reaction was as immediate and intense as the European reaction to spices would be 1,500 years later. Roman aristocrats loved silk with an almost embarrassing fervency. Roman moralists despised it for exactly the same reasons that made it popular. It was foreign, fantastically expensive, and in the case of the sheer varieties popular among Roman women, quite transparent, which offended the moralists, even as it delighted everyone else. The Emperor Augustus reportedly tried to ban the wearing of silk by Roman men on the grounds that it was effeminate. The historian Seneca complained that silk garments left women naked in public. None of the complaints made the slightest difference to demand. Roman silk imports continued to grow, and so did the Roman gold flowing east to pay for them. The supply chain that brought silk from China to Rome was one of the most complex and multinational commercial systems the ancient world produced. The goods traveled overland across Central Asia, along a series of routes that wound through the oasis towns of the Taklamakan Desert, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand, Merv, before crossing the Iranian plateau to the Mesopotamian cities of the Parthian and later Sassanid Persian empires, and from there to the Levantine ports, where Roman merchants bought them. At every stage, a different set of intermediaries took their cut, adding their markup and keeping their section of the route as their exclusive commercial territory. The Parthians and Persians, like the Arab merchants in the spice trade, were perfectly positioned to prevent direct contact between the Chinese producers and the Roman buyers, and they exploited this position with considerable skill. The Romans tried, more than once, to find a way around the Persian intermediaries. They attempted to negotiate direct sea routes through the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean, and actually succeeded in establishing some direct contact with Indian traders who occasionally carried Chinese silk. They sought alliances with the nomadic peoples of Central Asia, who might provide an alternative overland route. None of these efforts broke the Persian stranglehold on the silk trade in any lasting way, and the Romans continued to pay Persian prices for Chinese fabric until the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist. The Silk Road. And it should be noted that this phrase was invented by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877 and was never used by anyone who actually travelled it in antiquity. It was not a single road, but a network of routes, shifting and reforming over centuries, depending on the political and military conditions of the regions through which they passed. At its height, it connected the Han Chinese capital at Luoyang, or Chang'an, with Rome, spanning roughly 8,000 kilometers of desert, mountain, and steppe. Silk was its most famous cargo, but it carried much else besides. Paper, porcelain, and bronze from China, cotton, spices and precious stones from India, glass, silver, and gold from Rome, horses from the Central Asian steppes. Ideas travelled on it too. Buddhism spread eastward into China along the Silk Road. Christianity spread into Central Asia along the same routes, and the mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the ancient world circulated among the civilizations connected by these paths. But silk was what gave the route its name and its economic logic, and the secret of its production was what made it worth killing to protect. Chinese law specified the death penalty for exporting silkworms or mulberry seeds, and the border controls along the western frontiers were, for centuries, effective. So effective that the first accounts of silk production reaching Western writers were so garbled as to be almost comic. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, described the Chinese, whom he called the Seres, the silk people, as combing a fine white fluff from the leaves of trees. He had somehow received a description of the worm spinning its thread while attached to a mulberry tree, processed it through several layers of translation and misunderstanding, and arrived at an image of pastoral simplicity that bore no relationship to the complex, labor-intensive industrial process that actual sericulture required. By the Byzantine period, roughly the 5th and 6th centuries AD, silk had become so central to the Eastern Roman economy that the empire was running significant trade deficits to maintain its supply. Justinian, the great Byzantine emperor, tried several strategies to reduce this dependence. He attempted to negotiate a sea route around Persia, through Ethiopia and the Red Sea, working with the Aksumite Kingdom of East Africa to establish direct contact with Indian and potentially Chinese suppliers. This project largely failed, partly because the Aksumites were themselves not particularly interested in helping Byzantium bypass a trade route that benefited the entire region's merchant class. The monks with the walking staves, whatever the truth of that specific story, represent something that was certainly happening in the 6th century, a concerted Byzantine effort to acquire the knowledge of silk production directly through espionage or smuggling, rather than continuing to pay Persian prices indefinitely. whether monks or merchants or diplomatic envoys eventually succeeded in the transfer. Byzantium did establish its own silk industry in the 6th century, and Byzantine silk became one of the most prestigious luxury goods in the medieval Western world. Purple silk, dyed with the expensive Tyrian purple, extracted from murex snails, was reserved for the imperial family alone, and Byzantine emperors used gifts of silk to reward allies and impress foreign dignitaries in the same way that a modern state might offer military or economic aid. The Chinese, for their part, were never under any illusions about why their silk was so valuable, and they used it with deliberate sophistication as a diplomatic instrument. Silk was sent as tribute payments to nomadic border peoples whose goodwill was essential to Chinese security. The Xiongnu Confederacy, on the northern frontier, for instance, received enormous quantities of silk as part of the treaties that kept them from raiding Chinese territory. This practice was essentially paying protection money in fabric, and it established silk as a form of currency in the diplomatic economy of Central Asia that would persist for centuries. The Great Overland Silk Road began to decline. Not disappear, but decline, with the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, which disrupted the Central Asian oasis towns that served as its waypoints and rest stations, and with the subsequent rise of the Ottoman Empire, which made overland travel from Europe to Asia increasingly complicated and expensive. The sea routes that the Portuguese would eventually open around Africa began to compete with and eventually supersede the overland silk trade, just as they did with the spice trade. Chinese silk continued to flow westward, but increasingly through the ports of Southeast Asia, rather than across the deserts of Central Asia, and increasingly in the holds of European ships, rather than on the backs of Central Asian camels. Japan had obtained the secret of silk production from China sometime in the 4th or 5th century AD, and Japanese silk became its own tradition of extraordinary refinement. The complex silk weaving techniques that produced Japanese brocades like nishiki and kinran represented a development of Chinese techniques that Japanese artisans had taken in their own direction over 1,000 years of practice. When Japan eventually opened to Western trade in the 19th century, silk was the country's primary export, and Japanese silk dominated the global market in a way that connected those ancient mulberry forests directly to the factories of Lyon and the boutiques of Paris. Today, China still produces roughly half the world's silk, and the mulberry silkworm is still the primary source. The process, in its essentials, is not dramatically different from what it was 3,000 years ago. The worms still eat mulberry leaves, still spin their cocoons, and the cocoons are still unreeled in hot water to produce the continuous filament that is silk's defining characteristic. The monks' walking staves, the Silk Road caravans, the Byzantine purple dye vats, all of it sits behind a piece of fabric that is still, if you reach for it, unlike anything else in the world to touch. There is a moment in the history of Mali, sometime in the 14th century, that captures better than anything else the extraordinary value of salt in the pre-modern world. A merchant from the north, crossing the Sahara Desert from the salt mines of Tagaza, with a caravan of camels loaded with slabs of rock salt, arrived at a trading town on the southern edge of the desert, and found himself in a market where gold, actual gold dust, panned from the rivers of the sub-Saharan interior, was being weighed out against his salt at a ratio of 1:1 by weight. A pound of salt for a pound of gold. Salt for gold, equal weight. To the merchant from the north, This seemed almost too good to be true, which is probably why later historians and travelers repeated the story with such relish. To the traders of the gold-producing regions to the south, it was simply the market at work. Gold was something you had in abundance. Salt was something you could not make, could not find, could not live without. The human body requires sodium to function. Without it, muscles cramp, the heart falters, the nervous system breaks down. Every cell in every living body needs salt, and in the tropical forests south of the Sahara, where the diet was heavy in grains and vegetables and light in the preserved meats and fish that supplied salt elsewhere, the mineral was genuinely scarce. The desert to the north, by contrast, contained entire mountains of it. The Sahara's ancient dried lake beds were massive deposits of rock salt, and the mines of Tagaza, where the houses were literally built of salt blocks because there was no other building material available, were producing quantities of the mineral that no one south of the desert could approach. The salt trade across the Sahara is one of the oldest long-distance commercial networks in Africa, and it sustained some of the great medieval African empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, as surely as the spice trade sustained the merchant republics of Europe. The caravan routes that crossed the Sahara, from the salt mines to the gold fields, were the veins of an enormous commercial body, and the cities that grew up along those routes, Timbuktu most famously, but also Djenné, Gao, and Agadez, were among the most sophisticated urban centers of the medieval world. When the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Mali in the 1350s, he described a society of astonishing wealth, order, and cultural complexity, and he was quite clear about what underpinned it: control of the routes along which salt and gold moved in opposite directions. The basic logic of the salt trade was the same everywhere in the world. Salt was essential for life and for food preservation. It occurred naturally, only in certain places. And in the many places it did not occur, it was expensive enough to trade for almost anything. This logic produced empires in Africa, commercial republics in Europe, and extraordinary wealth for whoever could control the choke points of supply. In Europe, the most sophisticated exploitation of the salt trade was Venice again, a theme, you will notice, that keeps recurring in the history of commodity trading. The Venetians, who controlled the salt marshes of the northern Adriatic and had established extensive salt-producing operations at various points around the Mediterranean, made salt trading an integral part of their commercial empire from the earliest days of the Republic. The Venetian salt monopoly was enforced by law. Merchants trading in other goods were often required to carry a certain quantity of Venetian salt on their ships, ensuring a constant market for the Republic's salt, even when other trade was slow. Salt revenues funded wars, built palaces, and kept the Venetian navy at sea. The link between salt and political power was not unique to Venice. The gabelle, France's infamous salt tax, was one of the most hated institutions of the Ancien regime, a regressive burden that fell most heavily on the poor and sparked genuine social unrest for centuries before it became one of the many grievances that fed the French Revolution. The principle that the state could claim a share of something as basic as salt, something that every human being needed simply to stay alive, was experienced as a form of tyranny by those who paid it. And the history of salt taxes is essentially a history of the relationship between state power and the basic necessities of life. The great salt marches of Gandhi's independence campaign in India in 1930 drew their power from exactly this long tradition. By walking to the sea to make salt himself in defiance of British colonial salt laws, Gandhi struck at something deep and resonant in the colonial relationship, connecting his protest to thousands of years of human experience of salt as a matter of survival and justice. The etymology of salt runs through the English language in ways most people never notice. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, believed by most ancient and many modern writers to derive from the practice of paying Roman soldiers partly in salt or giving them money specifically to buy salt. The evidence for this precise origin is debated by historians, but the connection between salt and payment was real enough in the ancient world. Salt was valuable, portable, and universally needed, making it a practical form of currency or supplement to currency in many economies. When we describe someone as being worth their salt, we are reaching back toward this ancient equation between a mineral and a person's economic value. The Roman trade in salt was essential to the functioning of the empire in ways that went beyond mere flavor. Salt was the primary preservative in a world without refrigeration. The preservation of food, the ability to store summer surpluses for winter consumption, to carry provisions on military campaigns, to process fish and meat for transport to urban centers, far from where the animals were raised, depended entirely on salt. Roman fish sauce, called garum, was a fermented salt-preserved condiment of extraordinary pungency that Romans used on virtually everything, in the way that people today use ketchup or soy sauce, and garum factories operated on an industrial scale throughout the Mediterranean world. The smell of a garum factory was reportedly detectable from considerable distance, which is why they were consistently placed on the downwind edge of Roman towns. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, was one of the oldest routes in Italy, running from the Adriatic salt flats near Ostia into the interior of the peninsula. Its age reflects the fundamental importance of salt supply to any settled civilization, and it was already ancient when Rome was a small city-state trading along its course. The Saharan salt trade, which had sustained the great African empires for a millennium, began to decline in the 16th and 17th centuries as European sea trade opened alternative supply routes, and the trans-Saharan commercial axis began to lose its centrality. But it did not disappear. The Tuareg camel caravans that carry salt from the desert mines to the markets of West Africa are still operating in the 21st century. Smaller, less economically dominant than they once were, but still moving on the same routes, across the same desert, following the same basic logic that made those routes valuable 1,000 years ago. The Azalai, the great salt caravans of the Sahara, are perhaps the longest continuously operating trade route in human history, a living thread connecting the modern world to the economic logic of the medieval Sahel. And somewhere in the registers of medieval Venetian commerce, in the salt accounts and the caravan ledgers and the tax records of the Saharan kingdoms, lies a fortune built entirely on the fact that the human body cannot function without sodium chloride, a mineral so ordinary that it now costs almost nothing at all, and so essential that human civilization has, at various points in its history, organized entire empires around the control of its supply. On the beaches of the Baltic coast, on grey mornings when the sea has been rough the night before, you can still find them. Small pieces of hardened golden resin, translucent and warm to the touch, washed up among the ordinary stones and seaweed by the action of the waves. Sometimes, if the light is right, and you hold one up to the sun, you can see inside it. A bubble of air, perhaps, or the delicate remains of a fly or a beetle, or a tiny fragment of plant material, preserved with absolute fidelity for 40 or 50 million years, locked inside its golden tomb in a moment of perfect biological timekeeping. This is amber, and for most of recorded history, it was one of the most desirable and mysterious substances on Earth. The ancient Greeks called it electron, from which we eventually derived our word electricity, because amber builds up a static charge when rubbed, attracting small objects and producing sparks in dry conditions, properties that seemed magical to the ancient world. They had several theories about where it came from. Some said it was the hardened rays of the setting sun, preserved in the sea. Others said it was the solidified tears of the Heliades, the daughters of the sun god Helios, who had wept without stopping after their brother Phaethon crashed the sun chariot into the earth. The Romans called it succinum, and sometimes electrum, and they used it for everything from decorative jewelry to medicine. Amber was believed to protect against a wide range of ailments, from goiter to plague, and physicians prescribed amber amulets and amber powders with complete confidence in their efficacy. The geographical reality of amber, which the ancient world understood only partially, is that it comes almost entirely from a narrow belt of Baltic coastline, running from what is now the Kaliningrad enclave of Russia through Lithuania and Latvia to the coast of Denmark and southern Scandinavia. The Baltic amber deposits are the fossilized resin of ancient forests that existed roughly 40 to 50 million years ago, during the Eocene epoch, when the Baltic region had a warm, subtropical climate and was covered with dense forests of resinous trees related to modern pine. When those trees produced resin, as trees do today, to heal wounds and deter insects, the resin sometimes flowed in quantities that created large deposits in the soil and along the riverbanks. Over millions of years, these deposits were covered, compressed, and eventually eroded by glacial action and washed into the Baltic Sea. They lie in deposits on the seabed, and storms regularly churn them up and deposit pieces on the beaches. The inhabitants of the Baltic coast had been collecting and working amber for at least 13,000 years before the Romans came looking for it. Baltic amber has been found in Egyptian tombs from the 14th century BC, in Mycenaean Greek burial sites from the same period, and in Bronze Age contexts throughout Central Europe, demonstrating that the amber trade was ancient and extensive long before it appears in written records. The sheer distance these pieces traveled, from the Baltic coast to the Mediterranean, thousands of miles through the forests and rivers of pre-Roman Europe, is evidence of commercial networks of surprising sophistication in prehistoric societies. The Amber Road, or Amber Roads, since there were multiple routes, ran southward from the Baltic coast through the river systems and mountain passes of Central Europe to the Adriatic, and from there by sea to the Italian peninsula and the Mediterranean markets. The route through the Eastern Alps, roughly following the valleys of the Oder, the Danube tributaries, and the passes through what is now Slovenia and Austria, was the most important corridor, and the towns along it grew wealthy on the transit trade in amber and other northern goods moving south, and Mediterranean luxuries moving north. When Roman legions marched into Central Europe and Germanic territories in the centuries around the start of the Common Era, they were not moving through commercially empty wilderness. They were moving through a landscape of established trading routes that had been operating for a very long time. The Romans, when they got access to the Baltic amber sources directly rather than through multiple layers of intermediaries, were almost as excited as they were about spices. The Emperor Nero reportedly sent a Roman knight on an expedition specifically to find the Amber Coast, and this emissary returned with quantities of amber so large that they were used to decorate the entire arena for a single day of gladiatorial games. Amber nets, amber stakes, and amber decorations covered everything, and the amber was distributed as gifts to the crowd afterward in the kind of display of conspicuous consumption that only a Roman emperor could manage. The historian Pliny the Elder, who wrote about almost everything in his great encyclopedic natural history, noted that a small amber figurine might command a higher price than a healthy slave, and he found this baffling and slightly offensive in equal measure. Amber was used in Rome as a material for carving, the same instinct that produced jade carvings in China or ivory carvings in the medieval North drove Roman craftsmen to carve amber into miniature figures, cups, jewelry settings, and decorative objects of extraordinary delicacy. The richness of the color, the warmth of the material to the touch, and the way it captured light gave amber objects a quality that no other material quite replicated. High-quality amber, carefully worked, had a depth and glow that ancient writers compared to sunlight, and the trapped inclusions, insects, plant material, air bubbles, added an element of natural wonder and uniqueness to each piece. No two pieces of amber are alike. The insects preserved in Baltic amber have, in the modern world, become scientifically rather than commercially priceless. The DNA recovery techniques developed in the late 20th century, which inspired, among other things, the premise of the novel and film Jurassic Park, although the actual science diverges from the fictional treatment quite significantly, have allowed paleontologists to study organisms from the Eocene in extraordinary detail. Amber-preserved insects, spiders, plant material, and even small vertebrates like lizards and frogs have revealed details of ancient ecosystems that could not be recovered from any other type of fossil. The 40-million-year-old world locked inside Baltic amber is a scientific resource of incalculable value, and it is one that the ancient traders who shipped their amber from the Baltic to Rome had no concept of at all. But perhaps the most famous amber object in history is one that no longer exists, at least not in any recoverable form. The Amber Room was created in the early 18th century for the Prussian King Friedrich I, designed by the sculptor Andreas Schluter and the amber craftsman Gottfried Wolfram, and completed over several decades as a room-sized installation of carved and decorated amber panels. It was given by Friedrich Wilhelm I of Prussia to the Russian Tsar Peter the Great in 1716 as a diplomatic gift, transported to St. Petersburg, and eventually installed in the Catherine Palace outside St. Petersburg, where it was expanded with additional amber panels and decorations until it covered an area of roughly 55 square meters and was estimated to contain 6 tons of amber in various forms. Carved panels, mosaic inlays, mirror frames, and decorative objects. Contemporary accounts described it as the 8th wonder of the world, a complete room glowing gold and honey and rust in candlelight. Every surface alive with the captured sunlight of a 40-million-year-old forest. In 1941, the German army captured the Catherine Palace during the siege of Leningrad. The Amber Room, which Russian curators had attempted to dismantle and hide, but found could not be removed quickly enough without damage, was taken by German troops, crated, and shipped to Königsberg in East Prussia, where it was installed in the Königsberg Castle and displayed to the public until 1943. After that, the record becomes murky in ways that have fascinated historians, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists for the better part of a century, as the war turned against Germany and Königsberg came under threat from Soviet forces in 1944 and 1945. The amber room panels were apparently crated again and moved, but where they went has never been definitively established. The most widely accepted theory is that they were destroyed in the firestorm that consumed much of Königsberg in the final battles of the war. But they were never found. Not a single documented panel. And the absence of any physical evidence of their destruction has kept alive the alternative theory that they are somewhere, in a bunker, a mine shaft, a salt mine, a ship on the bottom of the Baltic, waiting to be found. A replica, painstakingly constructed over 24 years by Russian craftsmen using historical photographs and surviving fragments, was installed in the Catherine Palace in 2003. It is beautiful, and it has been praised by everyone who has seen it, but it is a reproduction of something lost, and the lost original casts its shadow over the copy in a way that the copy can never quite escape. The Amber Room is the most famous missing object in the world, and it connects the modern world to the ancient trade that brought Baltic amber southward to Roman markets, to the Prussian workshops where craftsmen shaped it into something unprecedented, and to the catastrophe that erased it. The amber that ancient traders carried from the Baltic coast in exchange for Roman bronze and Mediterranean glass is now worth scientific study and historical sentiment. The Amber Room that it eventually became is now worth only the question of where it went. In a warehouse in Bengal, in the year 1830, a British official named John Crawford was supervising the loading of a merchant ship with the most carefully packaged cargo in the empire. The goods were balls of opium, each one roughly the size of a cannonball, weighing approximately 1 kilogram, composed of the dried latex of the opium, poppy pressed and shaped into uniform spheres and wrapped first in poppy petals and then in a skin of woven grass to protect them during transit. 40 balls to a chest, 40 chests to a consignment, thousands of consignments moving from Bengal each year to the warehouses of Calcutta, and from Calcutta onto ships bound for Canton. The British East India Company did not technically sell opium to China. That was illegal under Chinese law and officially prohibited even by the company's own rules. The company simply auctioned the opium in Calcutta to private traders, who then arranged to transport it to China themselves, where it was exchanged for silver and tea. The company maintained plausible deniability. The private traders made their fortunes. The Chinese silver flowed back to Britain, and the demand for the drug in China grew year by year, creating a customer base of millions that generated profits on a scale that no legitimate trade could match. This was the structure of the most profitable and the most morally catastrophic trade in the history of British commerce, and it was built on a flower. The opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, had been cultivated for its sedative properties for at least 5,000 years before the 19th century opium trade industrialized its exploitation. The Sumerians of Mesopotamia were growing what they called hulgil, the joy plant, as early as 3400 BC. and they traded its preparations to the Assyrians, who passed the knowledge of cultivation and use westward to the Egyptians, and eventually to the Greeks and Romans. The ancient world used opium primarily as a medicine, for pain, relief, for inducing sleep, for suppressing coughs, and for a wide range of other conditions where its sedative and analgesic properties were genuinely effective. Hippocrates prescribed it. Roman physicians used it extensively. Arab physicians in the medieval period refined its preparation and distributed it across the Islamic world, where it was used both medicinally and recreationally. It was Arab traders who first introduced opium to China, probably sometime in the 7th or 8th century AD, and for many centuries, opium's use in China was relatively limited and largely medicinal. The introduction of tobacco smoking to China in the 16th century via Portuguese traders created a new context for opium. Mixing opium with tobacco to create a smokable preparation produced a much more powerful and faster-acting effect than eating opium, and the practice spread rapidly among Chinese social groups with the leisure time to indulge it. By the 17th century, opium smoking was becoming a recognized social problem in China, and a series of imperial edicts attempted to restrict or prohibit it, prohibitions that, like most attempts to suppress a pleasurable and highly addictive drug, had limited success. The British East India Company, which gained control of large areas of Bengal following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, found itself in possession of territory where the opium poppy had been cultivated for centuries for the domestic Indian market. The company quickly recognized the commercial potential of expanding that production dramatically and directing the output toward China, where the demand was growing rapidly and the price was high. By the early 19th century, the company had established an opium production system in Bengal that was extraordinary in its scale and its organizational sophistication. Indian farmers were required to grow opium under contracts that specified the price the company would pay. A price set artificially low enough to ensure that the company could resell the processed drug at enormous profit. The farmers had little choice. The company's political control of Bengal meant that refusing to grow opium could result in loss of land, or worse. The Bengal opium factories at Patna and Ghazipur, which still exist today, though they now operate legally under Indian government control, producing medicinal opium, were at their peak, processing something like 4,000 tons of opium per year. Workers in those factories, exposed daily to the drug without adequate protection, frequently became addicted themselves. An irony that no one in authority appears to have been particularly troubled by. The opium was auctioned in Calcutta every few months, and the auction prices reflected the extraordinary margins available. A chest of opium that cost the company perhaps 175 rupees to produce sold at auction for 2,400 rupees or more, and the private traders who bought it then shipped it to China and sold it for more still. In China, the Qing Emperor and his officials watched the trade with growing alarm. The silver that had historically flowed into China, because the world wanted Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea, and had to pay in silver, since China wanted little that the world produced, was now flowing outward, paying for the drug. The trade deficit had reversed. More damaging, millions of Chinese were becoming addicted, including a significant proportion of the army and the bureaucracy. The Emperor Daoguang tried various strategies to suppress the trade, culminating in the appointment of a tough and incorruptible official named Lin Zexu to the post of Special Imperial Commissioner for Canton in 1839, with explicit instructions to end the opium trade once and for all. Lin Zexu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, a letter that may or may not have ever reached her, asking her to stop her subjects from poisoning China with opium. His argument was moral and practical. The drug was destroying his country, and any sovereign who valued justice should prevent her subjects from selling it. He then seized approximately 20,000 chests of British-owned opium from the Canton warehouses and destroyed it, dissolving it in water and salt and lime in great trenches cut in the beach at Human, watched by curious crowds who had never seen such an enormous destruction of commercial property. The British response was not moral reflection. It was war. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, was a conflict of extraordinary asymmetry. British steam-powered warships outgunned and outmaneuvered Chinese junks with contemptuous ease. British troops armed with modern rifles and artillery defeated Chinese armies equipped with weapons that had not changed significantly in centuries. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking, one of the most consequential and one-sided treaties in the history of international relations. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 treaty ports to British trade on British terms, paid an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, and accepted the continuation of the opium trade that the war had been fought to preserve. A second Opium War, fought between 1856 and 1860, extracted further concessions, including the legalization of opium imports into China and the opening of additional treaty ports. By the time the opium trade finally wound down in the early 20th century, gradually, under sustained pressure from reformers in both Britain and China, it had transferred something like £500 million sterling from China to Britain, devastated Chinese society with mass addiction, destroyed Chinese confidence in the Qing dynasty and in China's ability to resist foreign aggression, and set in motion a chain of events that would lead through the fall of the Qing, the Republican period, and eventually to the Revolution of 1949. The ships that carried the opium chests from Calcutta to China were among the most elegant and fast vessels of the 19th century. The clipper ships developed for the opium trade, sleek, rakish, built for speed over capacity, were the technological ancestors of the tea clippers that would later race from China to London. Speed mattered because a ship that arrived first could sell its cargo before the market was saturated, and because the merchants who ran the trade preferred their goods to move in and out of Chinese waters quickly, before any unwanted attention could develop. The most famous opium trading house, Jardine Matheson and Company, founded by William Jardine and James Matheson in Canton in 1832, built its fortune almost entirely on the drug trade and became the template for the great trading houses that dominated Asian commerce for the next century. Jardine Matheson still exists. It is now one of the largest diversified conglomerates in Asia, with interests in everything from supermarkets to engineering to financial services. Its founders' portraits hang in the corporate offices in Hong Kong. The fortune that William Jardine made shipping opium from Bengal to China became a dynastic wealth that has compounded for nearly 2 centuries into a company with annual revenues in the tens of billions of dollars. The distance between those Bengal warehouses and those corporate offices is exactly the distance that history travels when enough time passes. In the year 1708, a young alchemist in the court of Augustus II of Saxony made a discovery that his patron had been desperate for, and that the rest of Europe had been attempting, by various means both scientific and fraudulent, for the better part of a century. His name was Johann Friedrich Böttger, and he was not exactly a free agent. Augustus had initially imprisoned him to prevent him from taking his considerable chemical skills elsewhere, and the laboratory where Böttger worked was essentially a comfortable captivity. What he discovered, after years of experiments with various clays and minerals under considerable pressure, was the formula for hard paste porcelain, the specific combination of kaolin clay and Patunce feldspar, fired at the correct temperature, that produced a translucent, incredibly hard, brilliant white ceramic that was indistinguishable in quality from the Chinese original. The Chinese had been keeping the secret of true porcelain for roughly 1,000 years, in much the same way they had kept the secret of silk. The specific white kaolin clay, named for the hill in Jiangxi province, Gaoling, where it was first extensively mined, combined with the particular feldspar mineral, and fired at temperatures between 1,200 and 1,400 degrees Celsius in specially constructed kilns, produced a material that no other civilization had been able to replicate. European potters had been trying since the 13th century, when Marco Polo returned from China with accounts of a ceramic so perfect and so beautiful that it seemed almost magical. They had produced various approximations: Italian majolica, Dutch Delftware, soft paste porcelain using glass frits. But none of these came close to the true Chinese article in hardness, translucency, or the brilliant whiteness that served as a canvas for the extraordinary painted decorations that made Chinese porcelain the most coveted decorative object in the world. The blue and white porcelain style that became most famous in Europe, the distinctive white ground with cobalt blue underglaze decoration, was itself a product of globalization. The cobalt that produced the rich blue color in Chinese porcelain of the Ming and Qing periods was predominantly imported from Persia, carried by Arab traders along the same routes that brought silk westward. The artistic vocabulary of the blue and white decoration combined Chinese landscape traditions with Islamic geometric patterns in ways that reflected the cross-cultural encounters of the medieval trade routes, and then was carried by European ships to European aristocratic collections, where it was imitated, adapted, and eventually transformed into the Dutch Delft tradition and the British willow pattern, and 100 other European ceramic styles that are, at their root, European translations of a Chinese visual language that was itself partially borrowed from the Islamic world. The value of Chinese porcelain in 17th century Europe was genuinely extraordinary. Augustus II of Saxony, the same man who employed Böttger, was the most obsessive collector of Chinese porcelain in an age of obsessive collectors. He reportedly exchanged 600 Saxon cavalry soldiers with the King of Prussia for what he considered a particularly fine collection of Chinese vases, a transaction that became known in German history as the Porzellan Parade, and that illustrates with perfect clarity the relationship between military power and luxury commerce in the early modern period. He eventually amassed a collection of over 35,000 pieces, which required him to convert an entire wing of the Dresden Royal Palace into a dedicated porcelain showcase that is still known as the Zwinger. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the dominant carrier of Chinese porcelain to European markets in the 17th and early 18th centuries, and it shipped the stuff in quantities that are still astonishing. When the VOC ship Ritter Leeuw sank off the island of St. Helena in 1613, its cargo included an estimated 3,500 pieces of Chinese porcelain. When the Hatcher junk A Chinese merchant vessel that sank in the South China Sea in the 17th century was recovered by the salvager Michael Hatcher in 1983. It yielded approximately 25,000 pieces of Ming period porcelain. When the Vung Tau cargo, another recovered shipwreck, came up, it contained close to 48,000 pieces. These were not exceptional cargoes. They were normal commercial consignments of the period, and they speak to a trade of enormous volume that was supplying a European market, apparently insatiable in its appetite for Chinese ceramics. The impact of this trade on European material culture was profound and lasting. The fashion for displaying porcelain as a form of wealth signaling, covering walls and mantelpieces, and specially built shelves with Chinese pieces, transformed the interior design of European aristocratic and merchant class homes in the 17th and 18th centuries. The English term Chinaware, still used for fine ceramic dishes, and the common use of the word china itself to mean any fine ceramic, reflects how completely Chinese porcelain dominated the European imagination. The German town of Meissen, where Böttger's breakthrough was eventually industrialized, and the English factories at Staffordshire and Worcester, and the French Sèvres manufactory, were all direct consequences of the desire to produce domestically what previously had to be imported from thousands of miles away at enormous expense. Böttger's discovery, which he made in the company of the physicist Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus, who died shortly before the successful synthesis, broke the Chinese monopoly in exactly the way the monks' smuggled silkworm eggs had broken the Chinese silk monopoly. The secret eventually spread, as industrial secrets always do, despite Augustus's attempts to keep it inside Saxony through a combination of attractive salaries, comfortable working conditions, and the explicit threat of imprisonment for anyone who disclosed the formula. Workers did defect. The knowledge did spread. To Vienna in the 1720s, to Meissen's competitor factories across Europe in the 1730s and 1740s, and eventually to every ceramic-producing country in Europe. By the end of the 18th century, hard-paste porcelain was being made from Portugal to Russia, and the Chinese monopoly was a memory. But even today, 2 centuries after the secret spread throughout the world, certain Chinese porcelains retain a value that reflects the history of the trade more than the intrinsic properties of the material. A Song dynasty Celadon bowl, a Ming blue and white vase of the Xuande period, a Qing imperial family rose piece from the Yongzheng reign. These objects, when they appear at auction, command prices in the tens of millions of dollars, sustained by the same collector obsession that drove Augustus II to trade cavalry for ceramics 3 centuries ago. The white gold has not lost its luster. There is a ledger book in a Bristol archive dating from the 1750s that records the outward cargo of a merchant ship called the King David. The document is methodical and precise, written in a neat commercial hand: woolen textiles, copper rods, brass pans, iron bars, glass beads, and gunpowder. It lists quantities, costs, and the names of the suppliers. It reads like any other trading inventory of the period, except that at the top of the document, in the same neat hand, is a notation that the King David is bound for the coast of Guinea, thence to Jamaica. This notation, so brief, so businesslike, describes a murder machine. The triangular trade, which operated from the mid-16th century until the early 19th, was the most profitable commercial system in the history of Atlantic commerce. It worked, in its essential structure, like this. Ships loaded with trade goods sailed from European ports, Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Lisbon, Amsterdam, to the west coast of Africa. In the coastal trading stations and ports of West and Central Africa, those trade goods were exchanged for enslaved people, human beings captured in the African interior through raid, warfare, or purchase, and held in coastal barracoons until a sufficient number were available to fill a ship's hold. The enslaved people were then transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, or crossing of roughly 3 to 4 weeks under conditions of systematic brutality, with people chained below decks in spaces so cramped that they could barely turn, subjected to disease, starvation, and violence, at a rate that killed on average somewhere between 10 and 20% of each human cargo before the ship reached the Americas. Those who survived were sold at auction in the ports of the Caribbean and the American mainland, Bridgetown, Kingston, Charleston, Havana, and the money from those sales, combined with the sugar, cotton, tobacco, and other plantation commodities loaded for the return voyage, completed the triangle. The profits were extraordinary by any standard of measurement. A well-executed triangular voyage might return 300 to 400% on the initial investment. Investors in Liverpool and Bristol, who put money into slaving voyages in the mid-18th century, could expect returns that made almost any other commercial venture seem more pale. The city of Bristol built its magnificent Georgian architecture, its cultural institutions, and much of its commercial infrastructure on slave trade profits. Liverpool grew from a modest port to the second city of England, partly on the same foundation. The city of Nantes in France, elegant, prosperous, beautiful, did the same. These were not simply cities that benefited incidentally from a trade that happened to pass through. They were cities whose physical existence, whose social hierarchies, whose merchant families and civic institutions were built from the proceeds of buying and selling human beings. Between roughly 1500 and 1850, approximately 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic on approximately 36,000 voyages. Of those, roughly 10.5 million survived the Middle Passage to be sold in the Americas. The scale of this figure, 12.5 million human beings removed from their communities, stripped of their names and languages and families, and converted into commercial property, is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. And perhaps this is why it is often discussed in terms of systems and structures rather than individual lives. But it was individual lives, millions of them, that formed the actual cargo. The economic logic of the slave trade was reinforced by the structure of the plantation economies it supplied. Sugar cultivation in the Caribbean and Brazil was extraordinarily labor-intensive. Planting, cutting, and processing sugarcane required continuous physical labor in tropical heat, and the mortality rate among enslaved workers on sugar plantations was high enough that the population required constant replacement. Cotton cultivation in the American South was similarly labor-intensive, and the expansion of cotton agriculture after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 drove a massive expansion of the enslaved labor force in the decades immediately before the Civil War. The plantation economy was not merely sustained by enslaved labor. It was designed around it, economically and architecturally, in ways that made the entire system dependent on the continuation of the trade. The financial infrastructure that grew up around the slave trade was complex and sophisticated in ways that connected it to every other major commercial system of the period. Insurance companies underwrote slaving voyages. Banks extended credit to plantation owners, with enslaved people serving as collateral. The enslaved people were property in the legal sense, and they could be mortgaged, inherited, and seized for debt like any other asset. The same merchant houses that traded in sugar and cotton and tobacco were often the same houses that financed slaving voyages, and the fortunes built on plantation agriculture flowed into the same financial institutions that funded the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the commercial expansion of the young United States. When Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, and when full emancipation came to British colonies in 1833, the British government paid compensation, not to the formerly enslaved people, but to the slave owners for the loss of their property. The Slave Compensation Act of 1837 disbursed approximately £20 million to roughly 46,000 claimants, representing roughly 40% of the national government's annual budget at the time. This was the largest single payment the British government had ever made, and it was borrowed money that was not fully repaid until 2015, meaning that British taxpayers, including the descendants of enslaved people, were paying interest on the compensation paid to slave owners well into the 21st century. The enslaved people themselves received nothing. The resistance to the slave trade and to slavery itself was present from the beginning. Africans resisted enslavement at every stage of the process: at capture, at the coastal barracoons, during the Middle Passage, and throughout their lives in the Americas. The historical record of the Middle Passage is full of accounts of insurrections on slave ships. The crew of every slaving vessel lived with the constant awareness that their cargo, if unchained and given any opportunity to organize, might overwhelm them and take the ship. The Amistad Uprising of 1839, in which 53 enslaved Africans led by a man named Sengbe Pierre seized a Spanish slave schooner near Cuba and attempted to sail it back to Africa, became famous enough to reach the Supreme Court of the United States and eventually the cinema. But it was not unusual in kind, only in its legal aftermath. The abolition movement was one of the first mass social justice campaigns in modern history, and it drew its force from a coalition of freed Black Britons, Quaker moralists, evangelical Christians, and Enlightenment liberals who together created the political pressure that eventually produced the 1807 Act. The movement produced some of the most enduring political imagery of the period. The Wedgwood medallion showing a kneeling enslaved man with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" became one of the first mass-produced pieces of political merchandise, worn as a brooch by fashionable women and carried in the pockets of men who had no direct economic stake in the trade, but who found its continuation morally intolerable. What the abolition of the British slave trade did not do, of course, was end the trade itself. The transatlantic slave trade continued under Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian, and American flags for decades after British abolition, and the British Navy's West Africa Squadron, tasked with intercepting slave ships, was fighting a persistent and partially successful campaign against it for most of the 19th century. American participation in the trade was legally prohibited from 1808, but practically continued until the Civil War, and Brazilian imports of enslaved Africans continued until 1850, and perhaps beyond. The last known slave ship to reach the Americas, the Clotilda, arrived in Alabama in 1860, carrying 110 enslaved people from Benin. One of its survivors, a woman named Cudjoe Lewis, lived until 1935, and his account of the voyage and his life in Alabama was recorded by the writer Zora Neale Hurston and published finally in 2018 as barracoon. The wealth generated by the triangular trade and by the plantation economies it supplied did not disappear when the trade ended. It compounded. It moved into insurance, banking, textiles, and eventually manufacturing. It funded the cotton mills of Lancashire and the sugar refineries of Liverpool and the financial houses of the City of London. When we look at the accumulated wealth of the North Atlantic economies, the physical infrastructure, the financial institutions, the educational endowments, the cultural institutions, a significant portion of it traces back through chains of investment and inheritance that are sometimes difficult but never impossible to follow, to the holds of the King David and the 36,000 other ships that made the crossing. Sometime around the year 1662, a Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza arrived in England to marry King Charles II, and among the items she brought with her in her trousseau was a chest of tea. This detail, recorded by contemporaries and elaborated by subsequent historians, is usually cited as the moment when tea drinking became fashionable at the English court, and from the English court began its descent through the social hierarchy until it reached, some decades later, the extraordinary position it still holds today. The most consumed beverage in Britain, the ritual centre of social life, the drink that, as George Orwell wrote in an essay, that remains one of the finest pieces of writing about any commodity in the English language. A nation of tea drinkers will defend with remarkable passion even when it cannot agree on anything else. Tea, Camellia sinensis, is a plant native to a region of southwestern China, northeastern India, and northern Myanmar, where the wild tree still grows in ancient forests, some specimens more than 1,000 years old. The practice of drinking tea in China is ancient. The precise origins are disputed among various legendary accounts, the most famous attributing the discovery to the Emperor Shen Nong, who allegedly discovered tea's properties in 2737 BC, when leaves from a wild tea tree fell into his cup of boiling water. Whatever the truth of the legend, tea had certainly been cultivated and consumed in China for at least 2,000 years before Catherine of Braganza packed her trousseau. And the Chinese had developed an entire philosophical and aesthetic tradition around its preparation and consumption that was deeply embedded in religious practice, social etiquette, and artistic culture. Tea reached Europe through the Dutch, who brought it to Amsterdam from their trading posts in Japan in the early 17th century. It was initially a curiosity and a medicine, sold by apothecaries alongside other exotic botanical imports, and it was expensive enough that only the wealthy could afford it. The English East India Company began importing tea directly in the 1660s, and as the volume of imports increased and the price gradually fell, tea moved down the social scale with remarkable speed. By the early 18th century, tea drinking had reached the merchant class, and then the skilled artisan class. And by the mid-18th century, something extraordinary had happened. The British working class, which had for centuries begun its day with small beer, a weak ale that was safer to drink than unboiled water, had largely switched to tea. This switch had consequences that historians have been arguing about ever since. Tea is, of course, prepared by boiling water, which kills the bacteria that made untreated water dangerous. The question of whether the widespread adoption of tea drinking in 18th century Britain contributed to public health improvements, and through that, to the EOS population growth and workforce availability that powered the Industrial Revolution, is contested, but the correlation is suggestive enough that it has attracted serious historical attention. What is clear is that by the late 18th century, tea was genuinely essential to the British working-class diet, consumed in enormous quantities, sweetened with sugar from the Caribbean plantations, and that this consumption pattern created a commercial demand so large that it structured the entire British relationship with East Asia. The tea trade was, for most of the 18th century, dominated by the English East India Company, which held a monopoly on the import of tea into Britain and its colonies. The company bought tea primarily from Chinese merchants in Canton, where the annual season of trading was conducted under strict regulations imposed by the Chinese government. Foreign merchants were restricted to a small area of the city during the trading season, could not bring their wives, could not learn Chinese, and had to conduct all business through officially licensed Chinese merchants, called the Cohong. This restrictive system was frustrating to British merchants, but broadly accepted because the tea trade was profitable enough to operate within its constraints. The price of tea in Britain included a substantial excise duty. At one point, the tax on tea amounted to more than 100% of its purchase price. This created an enormous incentive for smuggling, and by the mid-18th century, it has been estimated that roughly half the tea consumed in Britain had entered the country illegally, carried in small, fast boats across the English Channel from the Dutch ports, where it could be purchased without the British tax. The smuggling trade employed thousands of people and was essentially tolerated in the coastal communities where it operated, since the alternative, paying the legal price for tea, was not practical for ordinary households. The government eventually responded by drastically reducing the tea tax in 1784, which made legal tea competitive with smuggled tea and essentially ended the illicit trade overnight, producing an immediate and dramatic increase in legal imports and tax revenue. The lesson that very high taxes on a broadly consumed commodity create more smuggling than revenue was obvious in retrospect. But the most famous episode in the political history of tea took place not in Britain, but in Boston, in December 1773, when a group of American colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of East India Company tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not simply a protest against the price of tea, though price was involved. It was a protest against the principle of taxation without representation, the British Parliament's assertion of the right to tax the American colonies in ways that the colonists had no role in determining. The specific mechanism was the Tea Act of 1773, which had actually lowered the price of legal tea in America by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to colonial retailers rather than through colonial wholesale merchants, but which maintained a small residual tax that the colonists objected to on principle. The dumping of the tea triggered a British response, the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, that accelerated the path to the American Revolution. The connection between a shipload of Chinese tea and the Declaration of Independence is not metaphorical. It is a direct causal chain, running from the trade structures of the East India Company through the political philosophy of the Enlightenment to the shots fired at Lexington and Concord. The cup of tea and the birth of a nation are connected by cargo. In the 19th century, the tea trade produced what may be the most romanticized episode in commercial history. The great clipper ship races from China to London. The development of the clipper ship, the extreme version of sailing ship design, sacrificing cargo capacity and stability for speed, was driven partly by the opium trade. Speed mattered in a trade that required quick, in and out operations in Chinese waters, and partly by the tea trade, where the first cargo of the new season commanded a significant premium in London because the tea market was set by the first shipment to arrive. A ship that arrived in London just a few days before its rivals could sell its cargo at substantially higher prices. And this economic incentive drove ship owners to commission faster and faster vessels and captains to push those vessels to their limits. The Great Tea Race of 1866, widely considered the most famous sailing race in commercial history, saw 17 tea clippers leave the Chinese port of Fuzhou within a few days of each other, loaded with the new season's tea, and race 99 days and 16,000 miles to the English Channel. The first 3 ships arrived within hours of each other, after 3 months at sea, and after covering the same distance that would take a modern container ship, perhaps 3 weeks. The winner, the Ariel, arrived in the Thames minutes ahead of her rival the Taping, and the 2 captains agreed to split the premium equally as a gesture of sportsmanship that became part of sailing legend. The Cutty Sark, launched in 1869, was built specifically to compete in the tea trade, and her career began just as steam power was making the clipper ship obsolete. She switched to the wool trade from Australia. The clipper ships were not immediately eliminated from commercial use, just pushed into routes where speed still mattered. And when she was eventually retired and preserved as a museum ship in Greenwich, she became a monument, not simply to a particular kind of ship, but to an entire era of commercial sailing that the steamship had extinguished. She still sits at Greenwich today, and her hull, repaired and conserved and partly restored after a serious fire in 2007, carries with it the particular melancholy of something built for a world that no longer exists. The British solution to the tea supply problem, or rather, to the problem of dependence on Chinese tea and the silver drain that paying for it required, was eventually botanical espionage of a kind that echoed the silk moth smuggling of the Byzantine monks. A Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune was employed by the East India Company in the 1840s and 1850s to travel into the Chinese interior, disguised improbably as a Chinese merchant, and acquire both tea plants and, more importantly, the knowledge of their cultivation and processing from the Chinese workers who produced them. Fortune's expeditions are among the most remarkable episodes in the history of industrial espionage, and they resulted in the successful establishment of tea cultivation in the Darjeeling district of Bengal and the Assam region of northeastern India, where conditions similar to those in the Chinese tea-growing areas could produce comparable results. Indian tea, particularly Assam tea, with its distinctive, robust flavor, eventually displaced Chinese tea as the primary supply for the British market, and the trade routes shifted accordingly. By the late 19th century, the tea that was filling British teacups was largely grown on Indian and later Ceylonese plantations under British management by workers who were technically free but practically constrained by debt and contract in ways that made their freedom theoretical. The commodity had come home to the empire, in a sense, removing the dependence on Chinese supply and replacing it with a system of colonial extraction that was at once more controlled and more comfortable for British commercial interests. The cup of tea that sits beside someone reading these words in the morning, wherever in the world that person might be, carries within it the full weight of this history. The clipper ships and the Boston Harbor protest and the East India Company's Canton season and the Darjeeling Hills and Robert Fortune's disguise and the first Portuguese ships that carried the leaf westward to a Portuguese princess's trousseau, are all present, dissolved and invisible, in that small domestic ritual. In 1545, a Bolivian llama herder named Diego Hualpa was camping on a mountainside in the Andes when he drove a stake into the ground to tether his animals for the night, and pulled it out the next morning to find it coated in a shining substance. The mountain was called Cerro Rico, the rich mountain, and the substance coating the stake was silver. What Diego Hualpa had discovered in the high, cold air of the Bolivian Altiplano, at an altitude of about 4,000 meters, was the largest single silver deposit ever found in human history. The city of Potosi grew up at the foot of Cerro Rico with extraordinary speed, fed by the imperative of silver extraction. By the end of the 16th century, Potosi was one of the largest cities in the world. Its population of perhaps 160,000 people made it comparable in size to London or Paris, and virtually every human being in it was there because of the mountain. The Spanish colonial administration instituted a system of forced labor called the mita, a corvée obligation, drawn from the indigenous population of the surrounding region, which required communities to provide a portion of their men for service in the mines. The conditions inside the mines, where workers breathed mercury fumes from the amalgamation process used to separate silver from ore, worked in near total darkness with hand tools, and were regularly killed by cave-ins, flooding, and exhaustion, were lethal enough that the indigenous population of the region declined dramatically over the colonial period. The mountain is still mined today, under conditions that have improved but remain dangerous, by independent miners' cooperatives that continue to extract silver and zinc from the depleted veins. The silver of Potosi and the gold of Mexico and Peru, extracted during the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires, flowed into the Spanish colonial economy, and from there into the global trading system, in quantities that transformed the economics of the entire world. The mechanism of this transformation, sometimes called the price revolution, has been debated by economic historians for generations, but its broad outlines are clear. The influx of American precious metals into the European money supply in the 16th century caused price inflation throughout Europe that eroded the purchasing power of fixed incomes and wages, benefited debtors at the expense of creditors, and contributed to a period of social dislocation and economic change that historians have connected to everything from the English enclosures to the growth of early capitalism. But the most dramatic impact of the American silver was not in Europe, it was in China. The Ming dynasty, which had experimented with paper money and abandoned it after a series of inflationary disasters, had settled on silver as its primary monetary metal by the 16th century, and its demand for silver was essentially unlimited. China was the world's largest economy and the world's largest net importer of silver, and the American mines, via the Manila galleon trade, were the primary supply. The Manila galleon trade, which operated from 1565 to 1815, was the longest regular ocean voyage in the history of sail, and it was perhaps the most important single trade route for understanding how the global economy of the early modern period actually functioned. The route ran from Acapulco on the Pacific coast of Mexico to Manila in the Philippines, a crossing of about 12,000 kilometers that took between 3 and 4 months, depending on the winds. And that was accomplished in both directions by ships that were among the largest ever built under sail, carrying cargoes worth millions of pesos. American silver went west across the Pacific to Manila, From Manila, Chinese merchants, who were not permitted by the Spanish to travel to Mexico directly, delivered silk, porcelain, spices, and other goods that were transshipped to the galleons and taken east to Acapulco. From Acapulco, the goods traveled overland to Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico, where they were loaded onto ships for the transatlantic crossing to Seville. The Manila galleon was therefore the central node of a genuinely global trading circuit, connecting American silver to Asian manufacturers to European consumers, and closing a loop that spanned all three major oceans. It was, in its time, the first truly global supply chain, and it operated with remarkable regularity for 2.5 centuries, despite the hazards of the Pacific crossing, the ever-present threat of piracy, and the periodic wars that disrupted European-Asian commerce. The galleon that made the crossing was a floating city, carrying hundreds of sailors and passengers, enormous quantities of goods, and sometimes significant amounts of gold in addition to the silver, and representing a concentration of commercial value that made it a target for anyone with a fast ship and the will to use it. The English, who spent much of the 16th and 17th centuries fighting the Spanish for maritime supremacy, found the Manila galleons particularly attractive targets. Francis Drake captured a galleon called the Cacafuego in 1579 and returned to England with a cargo of silver that was worth more than the entire annual revenue of the English crown. Thomas Cavendish captured the Santa Ana in 1587. Woodes Rogers, a privateer who has the additional distinction of having rescued Alexander Selkirk, the model for Robinson Crusoe, from a desert island, captured a Manila galleon called the Nuestra Señora de la Encarnación Desengaño in 1709. These captures were not merely adventures. They were financial events of national significance, and the wealth they produced flowed directly into the English commercial economy. The distinction between piracy and privateering was, in practice, largely one of political authorization. A privateer held a letter of marque from a sovereign government, authorizing him to attack and capture the shipping of specified enemy nations and keep a portion of the proceeds. A pirate did the same thing without the letter. The practical difference at sea, from the perspective of the ship being attacked, was negligible, but the legal and commercial difference was significant. Privateering was a form of state-sponsored venture capitalism, in which private individuals assume the risks and costs of naval warfare in exchange for the right to profit from its results. The English crown, which could not afford a navy large enough to challenge Spain directly, found the privateer system extremely convenient, and it was under royal authorization that Drake and Cavendish made their careers. The gold and silver that Spain extracted from the Americas did not, in the long run, make Spain wealthy in a durable sense. The influx of precious metal inflated Spanish prices, made Spanish manufactures uncompetitive, and was largely passed through the Spanish economy into the hands of the Dutch, English, and German merchants and financiers, who supplied Spain with the manufactured goods it could no longer efficiently produce itself. The Spanish crown, despite receiving enormous quantities of treasure from the Americas, was regularly bankrupt, having borrowed against future silver deliveries at ruinous interest rates to fund its wars and maintain its empire. The silver of Potosi paid for the armies that Spain deployed in the Netherlands, and those same armies kept the Dutch in revolt for 80 years. And out of that revolt grew the Dutch Republic and the Dutch Commercial Empire, and the VOC and the entire Dutch century of commercial dominance, paid for, ultimately, by the mountain in Bolivia. on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, on the routes that the Manila galleons sailed, there are still dozens of unrecovered wrecks. The most valuable, the ones that went down in deep water with full cargoes of silver, may contain quantities of metal worth tens or hundreds of millions of dollars at current prices. Treasure hunting in Pacific waters is an active industry, and the legal and ethical complexities around recovering historical shipwrecks, which intersect questions of sovereignty, cultural heritage, and commercial exploitation in ways that courts have been struggling with for decades, ensure that the silver on the ocean floor will remain the subject of dispute long after any individual find is made. The mountain is still giving up its silver, slowly, in rusty fragments from the bottom of the sea. Not every cargo that made sailors rich was dramatic enough to start a war or build an empire. Some of the most profitable goods in commercial history are things that the modern world barely remembers as commodities at all. Substances and products that sit so far outside our current conception of value that their historical importance is almost impossible to credit. Consider indigo, the deep blue dye extracted from the leaves of the indigofera plant, a rich, saturated, permanent blue that no European plant dye could produce at anything like the same intensity or durability, was one of the most valuable agricultural commodities of the colonial period, and it was the foundation on which the plantation economies of Carolina and Georgia were built before cotton took over. Eliza Lucas Pinckney, a South Carolina plantation manager, working in her father's absence in the 1740s, was the person responsible for successfully cultivating indigo as a commercial crop in the British North. American colonies, working with a Barbadian indigo expert named Nicholas Cromwell, and persisting through several years of failed harvests and deliberate sabotage, by a worker who feared that a successful indigo industry in Carolina would hurt the Barbadian trade. When she succeeded, the value of indigo exports from South Carolina grew from nothing to a substantial portion of the colony's total trade within a decade, and it contributed to the economic foundations of a planter class whose wealth would later sustain the Confederacy. The blue that dyed British naval uniforms and the fashionable waistcoats of Georgian England was grown by enslaved people in Carolina, using knowledge brought from West Africa by those same enslaved people who had been cultivating indigo in Senegambia for centuries before they were transported across the Atlantic. Guano, the accumulated droppings of seabirds and bats, seems an unlikely candidate for a history of cargo that made men rich. And yet there was a period in the mid-19th century when guano was arguably the most valuable commodity in the world relative to its weight and its function. The discovery by European agricultural scientists in the 1840s that the nitrogen-rich deposits of guano on certain Pacific islands were extraordinarily effective as a fertilizer coincided with a period of agricultural crisis in Europe and North America. Soils that had been intensively farmed for generations were exhausted, yields were falling, and the growing urban populations that the Industrial Revolution was creating needed to be fed. Peruvian guano, deposited over millennia on the islands of the Peruvian coast by the vast seabird colonies that nested there, built up in some places to depths of 60 meters, was the answer. And the trade that developed around it was as structurally similar to the spice trade as anything produced in the 19th century. The Peruvian government declared the guano deposits a state monopoly in 1841 and contracted with British and American merchants to export the material. The labor of extracting and loading it was performed by Chinese contract workers. Coolies, in the brutal parlance of the period, who were recruited under contracts that were, in practice, indistinguishable from slavery. The mortality rate among Chinese workers on the Peruvian guano islands was high enough to cause comment, even in an era when colonial labor practices were not generally the subject of humanitarian concern. The profits, however, were large enough to fund the Peruvian government for decades, which spent them on railways, naval vessels, and the architecture of Lima. When the guano eventually ran out, when the deposits, which had taken thousands of years to accumulate, were exhausted in less than 40 years of intensive extraction, the Peruvian economy collapsed, and the War of the Pacific with Chile in 1879 to 83, which Peru lost catastrophically, was partly a war over control of the remaining guano and nitrate deposits that had replaced guano as the primary source of agricultural fertilizer. The guano trade is one of the most concise illustrations in history of what economists call resource curse, the combination of a valuable, finite, and geographically concentrated natural resource with a political system unable or unwilling to invest the resulting wealth in durable productive capacity, tends to produce short-term prosperity followed by long-term catastrophe. The same pattern that played out with Peruvian guano has played out with oil, diamonds, and various other commodities in various countries over the past 2 centuries, and the ghost of Cerro Rico hangs over all of them. Ice seems like the most improbable commodity on this list, and yet ice was, for a remarkable period in the 19th century, one of the most valuable exports of the northeastern United States. Frederick Tudor, a Boston merchant who was sufficiently eccentric to be nicknamed the Ice King, began in 1806 to cut blocks of ice from the frozen ponds and lakes of New England in winter, pack them in sawdust insulation, and ship them to the Caribbean, where tropical heat made cold drinks and ice cream seem like luxuries worth paying for. His first voyage was essentially a failure. No one in Martinique had any ice storage, and the entire cargo melted before he could sell it. But Tudor was persistent to the point of obsession, and he gradually worked out the technical details of ice storage and the commercial details of creating demand in markets that had never had access to ice at all. By the 1840s and 1850s, the Tudor Ice Company was shipping ice to Cuba, to South America, to Madeira, to Calcutta, and eventually to Bombay, Madras, and Ceylon. The ice arrived after a voyage of 3 to 5 months in insulated ships, with enough surviving to be commercially useful, a remarkable feat of logistics that depended entirely on the insulating properties of sawdust and the efficiency of Tudor's ice houses, which he built at destination ports as a necessary part of developing the market. American ice was being chipped into cocktails in Calcutta, was being used to preserve fish in Bombay, and was being prescribed by doctors in tropical ports as a treatment for fevers. The Indian press marveled at the technology that could bring winter from Massachusetts to the Bay of Bengal. The ice trade lasted as a commercially significant enterprise until the development of mechanical refrigeration in the latter half of the 19th century made natural ice unnecessary. But at its peak, it employed thousands of workers in New England, consumed enormous quantities of sawdust from the lumber industry, and generated profits substantial enough to make Frederick Tudor a wealthy man and to inspire a Harvard philosopher named Henry David Thoreau to contemplate the commerce of ice with a mixture of fascination and metaphysical unease in the pages of Walden, written while he watched the ice cutters working on Walden Pond. Tulip bulbs deserve a brief moment not because they made sailors rich specifically, but because they represent the purest expression of the cargo as fantasy that underlies all commodity trading. The Dutch tulip mania of 1636 to 37 was the first well-documented speculative bubble in history. A period of several months during which the price of tulip bulbs in the Netherlands rose to levels that, at the peak, saw single bulbs of particularly prized varieties selling for more than the price of a well-appointed Amsterdam house. The tulip had been introduced to the Netherlands from the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 16th century, and its novelty, combined with the Dutch merchant class's established habit of investing in commodities, created the conditions for speculation. The most prized varieties, those affected by a mosaic virus that produced streaked and flamed color patterns that were botanically unstable, but visually extraordinary, commanded prices that had no relationship to any intrinsic value. When the bubble collapsed in February 1637, it did so almost overnight, leaving investors holding bulbs worth a fraction of what they had paid. The tulip mania has been so frequently cited as a historical exemplar of irrational speculation that it has acquired a slightly mythologized quality. More recent historical research suggests that the bubble's extent has been somewhat exaggerated in popular accounts, and that the financial damage was less catastrophic than legend suggests. But its basic structure, the inflation of a commodity's price far beyond any fundamental value, driven by the expectation that prices will continue to rise and sustained by the shared belief of enough market participants to make that expectation temporarily self-fulfilling, is real, and it is the structure of every speculative bubble that has followed it, from the South Sea bubble to the dot-com crash, to the various cryptocurrency surges of the 21st century. The tulip is the ancestor of all of them, a dried bulb in a Dutch merchant's hand that somehow prefigured the behavior of global financial markets 400 years later. We return, at the end of this long journey, to where we began, to a ship in the dark, riding on the water, carrying something in its hold. The São Gabriel that brought da Gama to Calicut has been gone for 5 centuries, dissolved into the Indian Ocean, somewhere between the tidal zones and the deep water trenches. Every timber and every nail absorbed back into the sea. The cargoes that the great ships carried are gone too, in most cases, consumed, transformed, distributed through the metabolism of human civilization into the food that was eaten, the fabric that was worn, the silver that was minted into coins that were spent and respent until the original metal was dispersed across half the world. What remains is the consequence, the transformed world, the cities built and the cities destroyed, the cultures created and the cultures extinguished, the fortunes made and the fortunes lost, the people enriched and the people enslaved, the languages spoken in places where different languages were spoken before, the plants growing on continents where they never grew before. But the ocean keeps its own records. On the floors of every sea that sailors crossed, there are the physical remains of the cargo trade, the actual ships and their actual content, slowly becoming part of the geological record. The archaeologists who study underwater sites are, in a sense, reading the receipts of history, and what they find is often revelatory. A Chinese merchant junk on the floor of the South China Sea yields its blue and white porcelain in perfect condition, each piece wrapped in the straw, packing that preserved it from the journey and preserved it again for the centuries of submersion. A Manila galleon yield silver pesos struck at the Potosi Mint, each one carrying on its face the date and the assayer's mark that tells the archaeologist exactly when and where the silver was extracted from the mountain. A Dutch East Indiaman yields a cargo manifest in waterlogged paper that names every item aboard and every merchant who owned it, a commercial document transformed by disaster into a historical record. The ocean floor off the coast of medieval England contains the scattered wreckage of the wine trade with Gascony and the wool trade with Flanders. The deep waters of the Mediterranean hold the amphoras of the Roman grain trade, the oil trade, and the wine trade, some of them stacked in holds that are still recognizable after 2,000 years, because the cold, deep water has slowed the decay of the wood to a geological pace. The waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico contain Spanish galleons carrying silver that was never delivered to Seville, and English privateers carrying silver they had taken from the Spanish. The Tico, shallow channels off the English coast, hold the wrecks of the North Sea herring trade, the Baltic timber trade, and the East India Company's returning cargoes. All of it is down there, waiting for the combination of technology, funding, and legal permission that will eventually bring more of it to light. The shipping container that sits on a modern vessel crossing the Pacific today is, in its fundamental commercial logic, exactly the same thing as the bale of silk, or the chest of tea, or the sack of spices that sat in the hold of a ship 400 years ago. It contains something produced cheaply somewhere and wanted expensively somewhere else. It is moved by people who understand the wind, or rather, its modern equivalent, the fuel curves and port schedules and currency fluctuations of the contemporary freight market, and who are trying to extract the margin between production cost and sale price that has been the engine of maritime commerce since the first merchants loaded the first boat. The scale is different. The speed is different. The ships are enormous beyond anything that Da Gama or the VOC could have imagined, carrying 10,000 containers, where the San Gabriel carried a few dozen tons. But the logic is unchanged. It is still, always, about what is in the hold. The modern world has made most of these historic cargoes ordinary. Pepper costs almost nothing. Salt is a kitchen staple, purchased without thought. Silk is available at most fabric shops. Chinese porcelain is affordable by any household that wants it. The spices that once drove men around the world sit together in a single spice rack in any kitchen. The transparency of global supply chains and the efficiency of industrial production have collapsed the geographic margins that once made these cargoes so valuable. The mystery of where things came from, a mystery that was carefully maintained by Arab merchants and Chinese administrators and Portuguese navigators for centuries, has been replaced by a label on the packaging that tells you the country of origin, the ingredients, and the nutritional content. And yet, something persists. The gold on the ocean floor is still there. The amber washed up on Baltic beaches this morning was laid down 40 million years ago, and nobody has collected it yet. The descendants of the Bandanese people, who were exterminated for their nutmeg trees, still live on the islands where the trees still grow. The descendants of enslaved Africans who built the plantation economies of the Americas still live in the cities whose prosperity their ancestors created. The Cootie Sark still sits at Greenwich, her bow pointing east, toward the routes she used to sail. The Amber Room is still missing. History is not past. It is a cargo that every generation inherits from the last, carried in the hold of the present toward an unknown port. What makes it interesting What makes it worth following? Worth tracing backward through the centuries, from the spice rack in your kitchen to the volcanic islands where the clove trees grew, from the cup of tea on your table to the fields of Assam and the harbour of Boston and the forests of Fujian, is not the commodity itself. It is the human story attached to it, the desire and the ingenuity and the greed and the courage and the cruelty and the beauty that surrounded every cargo ever loaded onto every ship that ever sailed. Every fortune ever made by a sailor began as an idea about what the world wanted and where it could be found. The sailors who found it and brought it home changed the world so completely that we live inside their consequences without knowing it. The history of cargo is the history of everything. Every meal, every garment, every building, every financial institution, every geopolitical boundary, every culture in contact with every other culture. And at the center of all of it, always, is a ship on the water at night, riding the swells, carrying something in its hold that someone, somewhere, is willing to pay almost anything to have. The sea does not give up its stories easily, but it gives them up eventually, one wreck at a time, one amber piece rolling up the beach at dawn, one ledger book surviving in an archive, long after everyone who wrote in it is gone. We have been listening to those stories tonight, following the pepper and the silk, the salt and the amber, the opium and the porcelain, the silver and the tea, and all the forgotten cargoes that moved between them. They are not simple stories of profit and loss, though profit and loss are in all of them. They are stories about what human beings have always wanted, and the lengths to which we have always been willing to go to get it, and the world we have made in the process of going. It is a world worth knowing, and the cargo is always worth following. The sea is quiet now. The night is long, and somewhere on the ocean, the lights of a container ship are moving through the dark toward the horizon, carrying something in its hold that someone, somewhere, will pay for. Sleep well. The trade winds are steady. The current is with us, and the watch will change before morning.